Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Career Choice Series webinar on how to apply for a government job. Please note, these remarks reflect solely the personal views of the speakers and do not necessarily reflect the views of the Securities and Exchange Commission or the Social Security Administration, the individual members of the Commission or Administration, or their staff. The Career Choice Series is designed to give law students, young lawyers, and transitioning attorneys a general overview of a practice area and ways to position yourself to get there. The Young Lawyers Division is here to help new lawyers navigate the early years of their career and law students prepare for life after law school. The Law Student Division offers premium benefits, which includes access and savings for Quimby.com, discounts on bar review programs, up to $50 off West academic casebooks, and a legal ethics bundle that includes a free Model Rules of Professional Conduct ebook. Upgrade for $25 at abaforlawstudents.com/grow premium. The ABA Career Center offers both career development resources and a job board for law students and legal professionals across all disciplines and career stages. Today, moderating our program is one of our Career Center board members, Cheryl Heisler. Cheryl is the president and founder of Lawternatives, a career consulting company designed to help attorneys at all stages of their careers rethink and reevaluate their career options, whether inside or outside the law. Previously, she practiced corporate law at Catt & Mooch & Davis in Chicago and left the law to practice brand management with Kraft Incorporated. She regularly speaks at law schools and bar associations and has been interviewed or quoted in numerous media channels. Moving on, we'll let Cheryl introduce our panelists and we'll begin today's program.
Thanks so much. This is Cheryl Heisler. Hi, everybody. We are so happy you are out there and attending this really basic, interesting, and informational program. You guys who are listening may have remembered we've done earlier programs on would you like to get a job in the government? Now we're going to talk about how to do it, some of the ins and outs, and many of the things you might not know if you haven't already been in the government. With us, we have Chris Fortier, who is an attorney advisor with the Social Security Administration Office of Hearings Operations, and Sam Wice, special counsel at the Securities and Exchange Commission. Both of these gentlemen have been in and around the government, and they're going to tell us not only what they're doing, but how they got there and what we as listeners can take away for getting government jobs as well. So with that, if we can advance the slide, let's talk about, Chris, let's start with you. Tell me what you're doing, what's your current federal position, and how you landed it. And if we stop you along the way, it's going to be just to clarify for our listeners how they can learn from your experience.
Thank you, Cheryl. This is Chris, and thank you for joining us. It's definitely fantastic to be with all of you today. I work for an office inside the Social Security Administration called the Office of the Chief Administrative Law Judge. We oversee the hearings operations for Social Security Administration. You know, people do apply for disability benefits. They basically go to their local office. They either get accepted or denied. If they get denied, they can appeal straight to one of our 168 hearing offices across America. And then basically they get an administrative law judge hearing. We basically help the judges administer everything in their hearings, supporting them in their operations. Essentially what I do is I help maintain templates for our attorneys and our judges to use in making their decisions and justifying their decisions. Basically, how did I get here? Well, I started with the Social Security Administration getting close to 10 years ago. What we had was the stimulus package back in 2009, created a lot of positions. And so I basically applied for one in Charlottesville, Virginia. They hired me. I was there for 18 months. And then basically I got transferred up to Falls Church, Virginia, where I am now. We're starting in a place called the National Hearing Center, where we do video hearings. Essentially, it's basically like having a judge in their office. You have a TV, and a TV going into the hearing room. And we can do what that does is that allows our judges to administer hearings at various places across the country. Like
Chris,
to
excuse me, it's Cheryl. I'm
yeah.
going to stop you for a minute because some of our listeners are saying that they can't hear you, that you sound maybe a little bit quiet or a little bit muffled. And I know what you're saying is so important about your role with Social Security Administration. Can you try to lean in a little bit? And because we want to hear everything you have to say.
So while we're waiting for Chris, I'll begin. I'm Sam Wice. I'd first like to thank the ABA for inviting me to this, and just to clarify that all the views I'm expressing are my own and not necessarily the views of the Securities and Exchange Commission or its staff. I got started at the Securities and Exchange Commission as a summer intern. I applied for that position through USA Jobs. And then even though there wasn't an honors position or honors program when I was graduating law school, we were still able to apply for positions when they opened up within the SEC. I applied for one and I got it. And so what I do right now is I'm an attorney advisor in the Division of Trading and Markets. And what we have in the financial system are entities that have quasi-governmental power. They're called self-regulatory organizations. And in return for having that quasi-power, all their rules have to be approved by the Securities and Exchange Commission. And so I'm one of the people who approves those rules.
So, Sam, we're still waiting for Chris to pick up here.
Hello, how are you?
Oh, Chris, you're back. Okay, great.
Sorry about that.
Little technical difficulties, but I think we can all hear again. Chris, I'm just going to ask you to give a quick, short recap of what you said because people couldn't hear it before.
Yes, first of all, my apologies about the technical difficulties there. So basically, I got into my position. I started with the Office of Hearing Operations, Charlottesville, Virginia office back in 2009. Part of the stimulus package that was brought a whole bunch of positions, and I was one of them. Worked there for about a year and a half, then transferred over to the National Hearing Center in Falls Church, Virginia, which was another great place to work. And then after a few years there, I basically am here at the Office of the Chief Administrative Law Judge, supporting the hearings operation by administering templates that attorneys and judges use to make their decisions.
So one question I have for both of you right now, we're talking today about how to get that first job in the government, but it sounds like being in government is a good way to continue to get jobs in government. Is that a fair statement?
I guess I could start with that one. There are some advantages to being inside the government. Primarily, number one, being able to hear first when a position opens or when there is a need for a role to be filled. You tend to be amongst the first to hear about it. It really depends on where you are in the midst of everything. If you're at a headquarters place, yes. If you're in the field, it might be a little trickier, but you do hear about things occasionally that do pop up. And there are some positions that open up where the agencies do hire from within that particular agency and require some experience within the agency.
So one of the things that I want to point out to our listeners, and because I'm big on career consulting, career change, and networking, one of the advantages of networking, certainly with people in the federal government, if you want to move in the federal government, is that they may have I don't want to say insider information, that sounds wrong with an SEC guy on the phone, but they may have information about jobs that are coming up more quickly. So that even there's this sort of urban myth that you're not allowed to network within the government. We'll talk more about that later, but even if for no other reason than to know people who know about something that may be happening, it's to your advantage to have that insider view or that knowledge of something that might open up. Sam, do you feel the way that Chris does, that there's a slight advantage if you got a leg up if you're already inside the government?
I do. Besides just knowing about the application, a lot of hiring managers, although each hiring manager is going to make his or her own decision, will likely look beneficially upon government service. It shows an interest. And to just also add a little bit what to Chris says, even if you're not necessarily the first to know about it, it also helps to even know about it in the first place, how to apply. Because as we're going to go into detail more, a lot of these postings won't be on USA Jobs. So that being in the government, or at least knowing somebody about who knows the process with this particular agency, will cue you into where to look, if not USA Jobs.
Yes, we're going to come back to that. I've got one more question on this, and then we'll move on. When you say government service demonstrates an interest, what if you've done something at a state or local level? Should you flag that on your application as well? Is that something that will mean anything to federal government hiring agencies?
I would.
Yeah, and I would too. I would definitely give it a try because, again, that is subject matter expertise, that is familiarity with a government process that, I mean, it's definitely marketable.
All right, let's go ahead and move on. And while we're going to the next slide, and we may come up to this later on, but one of our listeners has asked, are there any military veterans on the panel? And if so, did you guys take advantage of a veteran's preference? Does it hurt or help? I'm sure it helps, but should we talk a little bit now at this point about how being a military veteran can assist you in your search for a federal government job?
I can take this. So just in general, for explanation, I think we're going to get to this later. Attorney positions in the government are what's called accepted service. So they do not have the same veterans preference that competitive service has, where in a competitive service position, if they have enough veterans who apply, they don't look at other applications. That's not true for accepted service. And so it's up to each hiring manager how they view the veterans, like being a veteran or the agency particularly. Now, a lot of people, I think, would view that favorably, especially because, just like we talked about government positions, it shows an interest and service to your country. And so I definitely emphasize it.
That makes sense, and it's consistent with where we're going now. The next slide is entitled Strategies, and what's the first bullet point says usajobs.gov. That's a great place to go, but it's not the be-all and the end-all, right, Chris? Would you like to talk to why that's good, but only gets you part of the way there?
Yeah, USA Jobs is essentially the central clearinghouse. There are always new positions opening up, and you get to see lots of things. You can sort your searches by locality. You can sort them by state, or if you're interested in going anywhere, you can just search anywhere, and you can search not only attorneys' jobs, but JD Advantage jobs, policy jobs. I mean, it's practically all in one place. It's essentially the Facebook of government job searches. It is essentially USA Jobs. You're able to apply. You're able to do upload a resume. You're able to do a lot of great things on there. However, I would not say that if that's a be-all, end-all. Yeah, you're going to end up being pretty lonely. Sometimes stuff takes a long time to reply. Decisions are made for various reasons, and your letter that you're going to get back, they will just say you've not been chosen for the position. And it could be for any reason. It's not necessarily, nobody could be hired out of an announcement. But I would say that, government agencies, depending on their hiring authority and how quickly they need people, they will go to various sources, just like private sector employers. They will go to places like Simplicity, the career services system. I've seen positions posted on the ABA job board. I've seen, this will date me, monster.com. They essentially are all over the place. And so I think what you definitely need to have is a broad strategy to look for government jobs. And that, I mean, even word of mouth, I would say word of mouth is probably the best place to go after things. However, you will want to ask, where can I apply for this position that you're talking about? So
we're going to come back to the word of mouth for sure,
yeah.
because I'm a big proponent of the networking. Sam, I think you had an interesting perspective on this when we talked before the program about different hiring managers have different ways to go. Can you put your spin on this for us?
Yes, and especially this will be important with talking about USA jobs. So as I mentioned a little bit earlier, attorney positions are accepted positions. So that means the normal government hiring process requirement rules do not necessarily apply. So an attorney position does not have to be posted on USA Jobs. Now, many still will be, but an agency could just hire somebody that they liked without having any posting or interviewing anybody else. So a lot of the important stuff is finding, if not by USA Jobs, how else does an agency post its openings? And this is one of the things I could talk about at the Securities and Exchange Commission, where many times we do have postings on USA Jobs, but we also have resume banks on our website where people can apply to different divisions. And it's not necessarily for a specific posting, but then anytime there's an opening in that division and when somebody's being hired, the hiring manager will also be forwarded the resumes from the resume bank. Or even at sometimes, depending on how many people are hiring or how many openings, there won't even be a USA Jobs posting, and the only avenue for getting resumes will be the resume bank.
So for listeners, on one hand, this is an eye-opening aha. I don't have to be discouraged. USA Jobs is not the only way to go, but it's also a little overwhelming. How do you know for the agency for which you want to work what the best strategy is?
The only real great way to do that is to ask somebody you know who works there or has gone through the hiring process. And one thing that I can say even about the SEC and maybe a lot of other agencies who have had a hiring freeze, it's hard to even say what will happen in the future because there isn't hiring now. There might be a new director of human resources, a new head of the agency who might want to take a different view. So talking to alumni you can find through your alumni database, networking any friends you might have at the agency, and keeping in touch just if they have any sense of the process for applying, which is a very easy ask. I found when people have asked me for informational interviews, if you ask for a job, I don't really know if there are any jobs. It's tough to give it to you. I'm not a hiring manager. But if you want to know like what the agency is like, how to post a lot of applications, that's a very easy ask where I can very easily explain that.
So let's go back to the resume banks for a second. And Chris, you may know the answer to this one. Can a student file their resume on a resume bank, or is this only for lawyers that are already have already gotten their degrees?
Well, it depends on the agency, of course, but if for a resume bank, yeah, you can put your resume in the resume bank. The only kicker is that if you're a student, you will not have anything that says, hey, I'm an attorney now. You don't have your law license noted on there. But yeah, I mean, you can put your name on there. And what may be the advantage to that, of course, depending on the agency, depending on what their needs are, is that you may be able to be hired for something that's non-JD, potentially a law clerk position, potentially a policy position, and I know we'll go over that a little bit later, but I mean, it doesn't really hurt you to put your name out there, but of course, is it going to be consulted? Is it going to be updated for you? Well, again, that's totally dependent on the agency's individual circumstances.
Do you update your own resume, or you just replace it with an updated one once you say pass the bar or have your degree?
Oh, I would definitely update the resume. I mean, if you need to write down every place where you've posted your resume, I'd say go for it. USA Jobs, if you were to make a profile, allows you to create a resume or upload a resume. So that is essentially the job bank of the resume banks of resume banks. But yeah, I would definitely I would, if you were passing the bar, I would definitely update your resume to reflect that, or else if an attorney job comes up, you won't be noticed if you have not updated your
Sure.
resume.
So anything that's relevant, materially relevant, should go on there. One of the questions that's come up, which is everybody's first question, is, well, what if I don't know anyone in the government? And I think, Sam, you touched on that when you said go to your law school and see who's been there ahead of you, right? A couple of classes earlier than you. Chances are there's going to be at least one person who's had a foot in the door at a federal agency. And of course, the way networking works is if that's not the agency you want, the question to them is, well, who do you know at another agency? And you try to connect the dots that way. If you have to go to, if your law school has nobody, there's ways to network through your undergraduate alumni and find out if they've got anybody inside the agency, albeit not in a legal position. So you can do research and read what people have written, although it's always harder to reach out cold. But I know some very creative networkers in the private sector, and as we're beginning to point out here, there are huge advantages to networking in the governmental public sector as well. So let's go ahead and look at the next slide. And we're going to talk about where we go from the thinking where else things are posted to how do you identify the kind of positions that are suitable for you. It's one thing to put your name on every agency. It's another to know if you're sort of fishing in the right pond. So there's a whole alphabet soup here, gentlemen, and I would like it if you could distill some of this down. I've seen OPM, GS, PFM. Just let's get started with definitions. When we say OPM, what are we talking about?
You want me to take this one?
Sure. I'll give Sam GS and PMP.
Yes, absolutely. PMS. Yes, so everything in the federal government, you seem to get a lot of acronyms and alphabet soup and all that stuff. Don't let that overwhelm you. There's a definition for everything, thankfully. So OPM, first and foremost, is what we call the Office of Personnel Management. They are the ones that administer hiring standards across the federal government. They are the ones who empower USA jobs. They're the central clearinghouse for your benefits should you get into the government, your health care, your life insurance, your vision, your dental, and a lot of other things. And they're the ones that, of course, have the central, the payment grid, the GS schedule, the general schedule. Sorry, I took that one from you, Sam. But essentially, they're the clearinghouse of essentially all things human resources-wise in the federal government. And I'm just trying to think if there's anything else about. Yeah.
How often well, Sam, go ahead. Let's talk about GS levels, and then we'll come back to see how are these codes useful for people applying for things.
So GS levels, those are the general schedule levels. They're on the range from 1 to 15, and these are the levels that are generally applied to career service employees. There are some agencies, for instance, U.S. attorneys' offices that have a different name and a different pay scale, but they all work in the same general way. And attorney graduates, your first year, you are eligible for a GS 11. And then for every additional year of experience, you can be an additional higher level. And in many postings, they'll say the initial level that they'll consider people for hiring, but also the promotion potential. So what that means is that it's not guaranteed, but in a non-competitive sense, meaning that there's nobody else you're competing against. It's just a yes or no question by your supervisor. Are you going to be promoted 1 GS level? For a lot of positions in the government, they cap out at 14 or 15. And what I suggest for people who are looking for a career in the government and not just a few years is to not actually look at what GS level you're starting at, but in the GS level, that's the promotion potential for the position. Because especially if you have a 10, 15, 20-year career in the government, that really the high level, if it's a GS 14 or 15, is what you're going to be paid for most of your career.
Let me stop you there. Does that mean you stop getting raises, or you can still get raises within that GS level? Can you continue to build your earning power?
You can continue to get raises. So there are much more substantial raises for each increase in GS level. But there are still two ways you get raises. One is the annual cost of living adjustment, which is sometimes not given, but was given this year. And then there's also merit increases, which are step increases that you get, depends on which step increase it is. But those are smaller increases, usually after about 1 year for the first like 3 increases, and it's 2 years after that, and then every 3 years you get those increases.
One of the
Yeah,
things.
that's like.
Go ahead.
Sorry, I was just going to say, for like your first 3 steps, it's like a year in between every increase, and then for 4 through 7, it's 2 years, and then 7 through 10, it's every 3 years.
So, if I understand what you say, if you are a new grad, you should be looking for things at the GS 11 level. Is that correct?
You can. I will also say that there have been some attorneys in the past that have been hired at the 9 level, slightly lower, but again, you want to take a look at the GS 9 or 11 through, and then there'll be a second number. It'll be 12, 13, 14, 15. That'll show the maximum earning potential. You'll still get everything that Sam said. Everything will still go. It's just you're starting from a 9 instead of an 11.
And starting at 9 is what that really means, is at a lower salary level.
Yes.
And there, I guess you could make the argument that there's more room for promotability then, and maybe that's a foot in the door that would be perhaps less competitive than 11 or at 11, 10 or 11 level. Is that true as well?
Depends on where the announcement is. Some locales, they'll be less competitive. Other places like Washington, D.C., New York, and maybe some of the other larger government employment centers may have more competition. I don't necessarily know if the salary by itself is going to make something easier to break in. It just really depends on where you're competing. But it could be an advantage for you if you're willing to take that salary hit for 1 year.
So let's go back to the geographics. And Sam, I know you and I talked about this on our panel together last time. People think of federal jobs in D.C., but that's certainly not the case. I mean, there are a lot of federal jobs there, but it's true to say that there are federal jobs across the country, and some of those might be foot in the door kinds of opportunities, correct?
Yes. So 85% of all federal jobs are not in the DC area. So most jobs are not in the Washington, DC area. And especially depending on what you want to do, there are more opportunities to do some stuff outside of Washington, DC. So for instance, if you really want to litigate, most of the litigation positions are not out of DC. They're in the regional offices. Now, if you want to do something like rule writing, probably most agencies are going to have that based in DC. But still, there are many opportunities and more opportunities actually outside of DC.
So maybe this sounds like a basic question, but if you know you want to stay where you're at and you want to work for the federal government, is there a special place you would go to look at for federal government positions in your area, or that would be go back to USA Jobs and look by location again?
At USA Jobs and by location, you can also look, although I don't know of any general database, of agencies that have offices in your municipal area. And so they'll likely have openings, although it's hard to say which ones will have attorneys based in that office.
Yeah,
and so it's going to take some
security. Oh, sorry.
Sorry, go ahead.
Social Security, we have 168 hearing offices across the country. We're in 49 states. So there is likely an office not too far away from where you are if you wanted to practice in our agency.
It sounds so basic, but I think it's important for people to remember you can still serve your country and work in a federal agency without picking up and moving. It also reinforces how important it is to network within the federal government offices or agencies in your area to find out who's there, what kind of choices you have, what kind of needs are in the, in the locale in which you live. And it goes against that myth again that, well, I can't network with government people. You can, you should, and you have to get the information that you're looking at. So we talked about salary ranges. We talked about the fact that with the levels come other possibilities. It sounds sort of silly, but when you identify suitable positions, just like you would with a job in the private sector, you have to see whether your skill sets match what the job is looking for. I don't know if there's anything more to say about that, but you can't just say, hey, I want to work in the federal government and send a resume or an application that doesn't fit at all. They're like any other employer. They want to know that you have the skills to do the job. So let's go ahead and move on to the next slide. And again, another pitch for networking. When you're talking to people, you can ask, what does it take to do this job well? What skills do I need to demonstrate? And then you make sure that that information is in your application. There are a lot of new grads with us today, or soon to be new grads, so welcome. But let's talk about how you get started if you think you want to work for the federal government and I'm stealing your guys' thunder. Let's talk about what you do before you're a grad and then what happens when you graduate. Sam, why don't you start with this one?
So,
Yeah.
So I actually suggest not doing what I did because especially with hiring freezes now, there's a good chance if you're interested in an agency, it won't have funding to actually hire anybody. So for instance, the Securities and Exchange Commission hasn't had an honors program in what's maybe now 4 or 5 years. But one thing you can do is you can show interest in government service or even in public service. So you can intern with an agency, although I do understand that those are unfunded, that a lot of people can't afford to take those. And so it's not necessarily going to be a detriment that you don't have it, but to show some interest, at least by taking classes in the issue set of the agency you might be interested in, doing pro bono work, maybe even writing like blog posts or something like that. So if you're not placed in a topic that you really want to go to long term with the government. And then one thing for the timing to remember is that a lot of it will be based upon the budgetary cycle. And as we had a recent shutdown, you might have definitely heard about that. So we don't know when in the year we're going to get our budget, but once we get our full budget, that's when the agency can be making determinations for the rest of the year and who to hire. So most hiring will happen about a month or two after an agency gets its budget, and then we'll find out who can hire. And a lot of times that won't match up when people are graduating. So that's one of the tough things, that even if you don't get a job right after graduation with an honors position or something like that, it's a lot easier once you've graduated and can basically accept a job almost at any time to get a job in the government.
So along with that, Chris, that gets to how to stay ready. Let's say you want to work for a federal agency, but there isn't something right away when you graduate. What would you recommend folks to do? What kind of position should they be looking at, and how do they sort of stay ready to jump at a moment's notice if something comes up?
Yeah, absolutely. As for what positions to look for, I would definitely recommend looking at JD Advantage sort of positions, maybe policy sort of positions, regulatory sort of positions. If you're ready to get in and just do something, you could do that. As for keeping your application prepared, I think Sam made a very important point. It definitely is about the writing. Attorneys do a lot of writing. That's just our nature. And so anything that shows off your writing skill, preparing a writing sample, talking about how you make your own writing product, that's definitely critical. To emphasize your writing skills and your written communication, because nearly all announcements will say has great written communication skills, oral communication too. So in the instances you have basically communicating anything to others orally, definitely put that in. I definitely recommend also thinking of situations where there was a problem and you worked on a team or you worked individually and you solved that problem. detailing the process you went through, detailing your contribution to a team if it was team-oriented, and how your solution made somebody's life better. We definitely like having that in written statements, in applications, in writing samples, in cover letters, and that question will likely come up on interviews, of course, depending on the agency. But I mean, to me, this is Chris speaking, I'm pretty confident that interviewers will want to know an answer to that question. So having those scenarios ready, writing them down, memorizing them so that you have them ready to go for when a position does open, and you can sell yourself as the best option for that agency to hire you.
Well, solving problems and writing are important with any job interview, whether you're going into the government or into private sector. But let me go back to two things. One is, it says jobs come once funding is authorized. Is there any way that a layperson would know when the funding is authorized, or that's just something that is internally decided and discussed?
You can generally know the timeline by following when Congress passes an appropriations bill. Although that being said, that's going to take that's going to be hard to follow because there are 12 different appropriations bills, and so you'll have to know the timing for each individual agency. So, for instance, with the shutdown, people saying only 25% of the government shut down. That's because actually 75% of the spending was already appropriated. It was only the other appropriations bills for the 25% of spending that didn't have their funding yet.
Interesting. So again, having a friend on the inside is probably the best way to get that information, unless you want to spend much of your day researching what's going on in DC with appropriations.
Yeah, and I'll just add that sometimes, I'd say I follow the process that was external. At times, money allocations shift within the agency. It's, Congress appropriates money to the agency, but then the agency appropriates money to its individual divisions. And sometimes funds that may be authorized for IT purchases or overtime may suddenly get reallocated because the agency finds it doesn't need it anymore. That may go to another full-time position that gets hired. And these decisions can be made pretty quickly and pretty suddenly. So sometimes you're able to follow it, other times you may not be able to follow it.
So that's why the resume banks are not a bad way to sort of continue to be ready to go. One of our listeners asked to go over again what an honors position is and who can apply for that. Would you gentlemen address that?
Sure. So an honors position is a position for after graduation. Usually applications are accepted by the agency in fall of your third year, although they'll also consider usually people who are currently clerking. It's a interview process over the fall of your third year, maybe going even into the winter or spring, and then they offer you before graduation a position once you've taken your bar exam.
And those options, again, we would find either through Simplicity or just all the different options we talked about before on LinkedIn, on USA Jobs, through your law school.
And sometimes the agencies will have special pages devoted to the honors programs and the honors program hiring process, as they are slightly different than what you see on USA Jobs.
And just another caveat to mention, because especially I came in not through the honors program, even though I was right after graduation, is that just because an agency doesn't have an honors program, or you're not hired through the honors program, doesn't mean you can't apply for a position and get hired for that position.
It's a plus if you have it, but it's not the only way in.
Yeah, well,
go ahead.
I wouldn't necessarily say a plus, but it's two different ways to get in.
Okay. Two different paths to getting in. That's fair. Mm-hmm. Here's a general question. Let's say you've got to take a non-legal job, either while you're at summers, just because you got to keep the money coming, or upon graduation while you're waiting. Is that necessarily frowned upon by a federal employer? It seems to me that if you can somehow make a connection. Let's say you're working in the securities industry, even if it's, or the banking industry, even at a retail level, perhaps you can spin that as you're learning something about the financial markets. But I know sometimes in private practice, firms turn their noses down if you didn't start with a law firm. Do you find that that's true in the government as well?
I'll start with this. I don't necessarily see that as a bad thing. Essentially, what you want to focus on when you're doing these jobs is instances where there is a problem and how you solve that problem, or instances where you're using written product. Definitely, that's the sort of experiences you want to get so that you can sell that position and sell that time in that position as experience. If you don't have something, I would definitely say one thing that gives you a leg up is time volunteering at a pro bono clinic as a law student.
Great.
I don't know if every state has this, but there are third-year practice certificates. If you're able to do a case during the school year, that definitely helps you in the long run.
That's such a good point. Volunteering as a way to acquire skills, get expertise, demonstrate an interest in an area makes a lot of sense. And I certainly know, at least here in Chicago, there are tax clinics, there are housing clinics, there are other ways in which you can demonstrate that you have an interest, that you care, and you could certainly flag that for a federal agency to show that you're demonstrating that you care and you do want to know about it.
There's subject matter expertise too. I'll just say it's a subject matter and procedural expertise too that agencies could use. That you have some baseline knowledge in a professional sense.
If someone is an evening student and is demonstrating that they are holding down both a full-time job and a full-time school situation, they can sometimes be prevented from getting some internship experience because they just can't quit for the summer and do that. It sounds like, Chris, you'd say the same thing. How do you demonstrate what your full-time job has allowed you to gain in the way of writing experience, problem-solving experience, subject matter experience, and then highlight that for your federal agency in which you're interested?
Yeah, and I will say, if you hold a full-time job and go to school in the evening, I personally think that's an incredible load to take on. And I mean, if it were me doing the hiring, I would take a serious look at somebody who can do that sort of stuff and juggle a career, just because when I give them an assignment and I say, could you do this on a priority, you've shown that you can balance and juggle a lot of things. And so the evening students who work full-time jobs definitely, in my opinion, deserve a good look.
And just to give two anecdotal examples from my group in the SEC, we hired somebody a couple of years ago who didn't necessarily have a legal job post-graduation, but it had been a banking analyst. And so we did hire him, although he did have to start at the 11 level for what would be for new graduates. So that's just one caveat to give. And then for night students, we actually hired somebody who was an economist, but didn't have a single legal internship for a position once he graduated.
So this is, I think, calming some of the fears of folks who are juggling, full-time school and full-time work. Related to that, if you're going to try to work in the federal government, but you have a gap in your professional experience, whether it's you took some time off and you're getting back into legal work, or you couldn't find anything professionally, you maybe just did some volunteer work post-graduation. I mean, I think I can anticipate what you gentlemen are going to say, which is the same thing. How do you demonstrate, however you spent your time, that you can write, that you can solve problems, and that you have subject matter expertise? No one thing, a gap, a non-legal job, seems to knock you out of contention. Would that be correct?
I mean, I'll start and I'll say, I don't think it necessarily by itself knocks you out. Of course, I'm speaking for myself when I say that, but yeah, I mean, when I've been doing legal hiring, when I've looked over resumes, me personally, and what I try to emphasize to my coworkers is, how does somebody fit into our particular office, our particular culture, what we do. And if there's something that hits me in the head, I'm definitely going to say, take a look at this person. I think he or she can help us in this way. We have the X need, Y need, Z need, and this person can help us fit X, Y, and Z. And they can, it's that sort of thing that gets everybody else in the room paying attention to a particular individual's resume.
That's the same as in the private sector. It's so interesting. Part of why I love moderating this kind of a program is that I learned so much. And the more we talk, the more it seems like there are less differences and more similarities between getting any job. What can you do for the organization? How can you help? Is it a fit culturally? Let's go ahead to the next slide and talk about, well, what if somebody wants to take their background and do something that we'd consider JD Advantage? For instance, policy, or something where you are working with your subject matter expertise rather than your legal expertise, or this PMF, Presidential Management Fellow. Hey, Sam, you're on alphabet soup again. Can you start with the PMF and we'll work backwards?
So the Presidential Management Fellow is, I would say, the #1 program to get postgraduate school non-attorney positions with the government. Especially because I know we talked a little bit earlier about accepted versus competitive service. With the government, most JD Advantage positions are what's considered competitive service. So they have to be posted on USA Jobs. If you're not a veteran or like done something in the Peace Corps, a lot of times your application won't even get looked at because there are so many applicants. So using the Presidential Management Fellow is a great way to do it. It's not a job per se. It's to get basically in a hiring bank for other jobs. So it's a huge process. Your career services will hopefully be able to help you out, and you can go to the website for it. But you basically do an at-home assessment first. It'll generally be in the fall of your 3L year, although you also are eligible, I believe, for up to 2 years after graduation. And then you can, and then the number of people they like, they actually bring you to an interview in the DC area. And anybody who passes that then becomes what's called a Presidential Management Fellow. And from there, you get special access to job boards, applications, or postings, and for getting a lot of the great program analyst, policy positions that go to people post-graduate school.
That sounds like a tool or an opportunity that a lot of our listeners may not be aware of. So that's great to know. Going back up to the top, Chris, do you want to hit any of these other JD Advantage type jobs, maybe put some labels around them if we know what those titles might look like?
Let's see. So particularly for policy jobs, which is what I probably have the vaguest familiarity with, research analyst, policy analyst, depending on the agency. I know at Social Security, we like to have specialists put on some of our titles. A policy specialist, technical specialist, expert has been used a few times. Essentially, that it's definitely in the position description. If you wanted to look at what the policy offices in the agency that you're interested in, what they're called, those should be on the agency websites in their organization trees. They'll usually have something like the word policy in them, so you should be able to find that. Otherwise, if you happen to have somebody you know in that agency that you're interested in, just go up to them and say, hey, what's your policy shop called? We do like to use that word too sometimes, policy shop, and they should be able to know. If not, they could probably look it up on their internal network to be able to find what the name of the policy office is. So that's definitely one way you could go at it. Would you like me to talk a little bit more about what they do in the policy offices?
Yes, I think that'd be interesting, and how a legal background makes you a better candidate for a policy job.
Yeah, so policy offices are the ones that tend to create the sub-regulations and the regulations. As you all know, you have the United States Code, which 42 USC, 1983, or all that sort of stuff, that's all created by Congress. The next level down, which helps the agencies interpret the U.S. Code, is called the Code of Federal Regulations. So you'll see those as CFRs. Those are usually divided up by particular agencies, and the agencies themselves get to administer. They get to write those policies. They get to change those policies, and it's those policy offices that particularly are the spearheaders of that. And yeah, and they're written like laws. I mean, what you have as an advantage as a JD or as a lawyer is essentially the ability to go through all this long and boring language that is the law and to decipher what exactly is going on. And yeah, you all have that skill, and the Code of Federal Regulations is written the same way. Policy rulings, too, which help the agency, which is the next level down, is another tool that the agencies use. And the policy offices also have a pretty heavy hand in writing those particular interpretations.
Sam?
So,
I'm sorry. Go ahead, Chris. Finish. I just had a take on it from Sam.
Yeah, please. I want to hear what Sam says, too.
No, well, Sam, I was going to ask you to add to that, but also, do you think policy jobs might be an easier hire, might be easier to get a foot in the door than attorney positions? It sounds like perhaps there are more of those, or is that just maybe because Chris is doing such a good job outlining all the different ways in which there are policy questions that come up?
I'll say in a great lawyer answer, it depends. Definitely depends on agency and location. Numbers-wise, there are more policy positions in the government, or JD Advantage, however you want to phrase them, than attorney positions. But it's also a different process. So, for instance, if you are a veteran or did the Peace Corps, I'd say it's a lot easier because you're going to be in the competitive, because it's a competitive service position, you're going to be given a preferential treatment. But if you're not in one of those, I'd actually say it's probably easier to get a legal position because then you're not having to deal with those preferences and applicants.
And also, policy would probably attract people from different backgrounds as well as law, because it is JD Advantage, right? So you might have a wider pool of people trying to get a policy job within the government.
Correct.
Yeah,
what
I'll
about
also add this. I'll just say that there are a lot of technical experts that come in, particularly like for the FAA, people who know about how to fix airplanes, airplane mechanics may be on board. They can kind of create a nice supplement to the team in addition to the law people, so that there's at least that the regulations that are written are enforceable.
Sam, I have a specific question for you. Do you find that there are certain divisions in the SEC that are perhaps more likely to hire new graduates because of the nature of the work they do, or because they're larger divisions?
Yes. So I just want to give this caveat. Nobody's hiring now because of hiring freezes.
Sure.
But traditionally, when there has been hiring, there's been a few divisions that have been willing to hire people straight out of law school. Those are the divisions of investment management, division trading and market, our OC division, which I'm forgetting what it means off the top of my head right now, is OCIE, which is our auditors, and our division of corporation finance. Those are the four divisions and offices that will generally hire people straight out of graduation, where other big ones, most notably our division of enforcement, wants people with some legal experience.
And Chris, can I flip that same question over to you in Social Security? Are there some divisions more likely to hire new grads?
It's a little bit different at Social Security. Of course, where I am, Office of Hearings Operations, I have to keep that plural. That's our name, not singular. I mean, we have hired people out of law school, but I mean, normally our timing does not really work that well. Yeah, I mean, there are definitely legal internship programs at our Office of General Counsel, and of course, within my office, the Chief Administrative Law Judge's office. But some of it just depends on the timing. Sometimes we may get somebody in. Sometimes we get somebody who is 6-9 months out. Sometimes we get people that are 3 years out. I don't think we really aim to do our hiring at brand new lawyers, but if it time's right and you're willing to go to a certain locale, you may be able to get a position once you have your GD and your bar license.
That geographic flexibility, the level flexibility, the willingness to network, the willingness to be ready and have that updated resume all fit in. I'm going to ask you guys one more question because we're getting towards the end and a lot of questions are coming in. Do you have any suggestions or tips so that when you file through USA Jobs, those bots will pick up the resume and cover letter and recognize you faster? I never know how that goes. I'm a much more of a people person, but I know a lot of the resumes and the cover letters go off into sort of the ether. Are there magic words or phrases that you would recommend anybody make sure to work into their materials?
Should I start this? Please hire me.
I'd like to hear from both of you.
Just kidding. I mean, what really works is you have to pretty much have your experience, your cover letter, your materials. It needs to be in sync with what the job announcement's asking. If you don't have a particular set of experience, or if you're not familiar with what something is said, you can admit that you don't necessarily have that. This is me personally saying this, but then to equate with something similar, something pretty close, because I know the position descriptions can be written in a way that seem pretty, how do I say it? It can be pretty intimidating to look at. But yeah, I would say definitely read the job announcement closely and try to align your answers or your statements as close to the written announcement as possible.
And we talked about if you do have, especially if it's not for an accepted job, what your background is, if you've done Peace Corps work, if you've done local government work, if you've done pro bono work. Sam, anything else that you found to be magic mumbo jumbo to get in there so that you get a better chance of being picked up?
I agree completely with everything Chris said. The one thing I would add is just remember where you're applying to. For instance, you're not applying just to the Securities and Exchange Commission. When we have applications, you're applying to the Division of Trading and Markets. Not just the Division of Trading and Markets, you're applying to our one specific office. So don't just say why you're great for the agency. Make sure to emphasize why you're great for that particular job.
Terrific, and the locality as well. We are all the way up to our hour, so I want to take a quick minute before we have our final wrap-ups to thank our panelists, Sam Wice, Chris Fortier. You are both extremely knowledgeable and generous with your time and your ideas for our listeners. Listeners, thank you for spending this hour with us. I hope we got most of your questions answered, and you know where to find us if there is anything further you want to add. And I'm going to flip it back to Lexi and Emily to close this program.
Thank you, Cheryl. Just to echo, we are very appreciative for everyone taking the time. Cheryl did an excellent job moderating, and Chris and Sam, there's so much content that you shared, I don't even know where to start. So thank you again, and thank you to everyone for joining us today. Coming up, if you like programs like these in the Career Choice series, we'll be covering, we're on the Career Choice series, we'll be covering copyright law coming up in April, and then the Me Too era and litigating civil sexual assault cases later in the month as well. The career development series is a different series that we put on, and we have a lot of upcoming programs, as you can see. A few just to name are Optimizing Lawyer Brain and Doing Right by Women in Legal Tech. So go to ambar.org/careers to get more information and to register. You can connect with us on social media. We're a little bit everywhere. We will post program updates and new programs on our channel. And lastly, to learn more about Cheryl and other members of the board who help make programs like this possible, you can view our leadership page on our website as well. Before you go, we would appreciate it if you take our post-webinar survey. It helps us with planning future programs as well. That being said, thank you again and have a great weekend, everyone.